The Senate is taking up voting rights today. The measure passed the House last week, but it faces a tougher road with Senators Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema's refusal to eliminate the filibuster. To discuss action in the Senate and the latest on voting rights legislation, I want to bring in Antjuan Seawright. He is a CBS News political contributor and Democratic strategist. Antjuan, great to see you. So, as you, of course, know, civil rights advocates made this a centerpiece of Martin Luther King Jr. Day speeches yesterday. Let's listen to part of the remarks from Martin Luther King III.
Senator Joe Manchin and Senator Kyrsten Sinema, who say they support the bill, but refuse to eliminate the filibuster to pass it. They think the real problem isn't that our rights are being stolen. They think the real problem is a disease of division that can be cured with some optimism and conversation.
So, Antjuan, do you think any of these speeches yesterday and all the attention that was paid to voting rights legislation yesterday had any impact on Senators Manchin and Sinema?
Well, the celebrations of the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King yesterday were just continued conversations that he had in his generation around equity and equality, with a laser focus on voting rights, the most consequential issue of our day, as it was during the days of Martin Luther King Jr. I watched very closely at some of the social media posts and statements that came from Senators Manchin and Sinema and others who have been against this idea of expanded and true access to the ballot box for people who have been left out of that equation for a very long time, primarily people who look like me in communities that look like mine. Do I think it changed their minds about the way they feel about the filibuster? Absolutely not. Do I think the fire alarm pulls that came from across this country from many voices, both traditional and non-traditional? Absolutely. I think what yesterday did, if it did not do anything else, served as a friendly reminder that every time we've had voting rights reauthorization in this country, it's came in a bipartisan manner under Republican presidential leadership. It's always been one of those things that Democrats and Republicans very rarely came to do in Washington, D.C. when it comes to voting rights. Somehow or another, this idea has gotten lost with modern-day Republicans, and within our own party, we have two senators. Forget about voting on the actual legislation. What they're doing in their effort to have conversations around the filibuster simply block the attempt to even have a vote. And so I appreciate the fact what Senator Schumer wants to do in terms of pushing forward in order to get people on the record about what they feel on the issue.
Well, let's take to your point, let's take the conversation away from the voting rights legislation for a moment and address the filibuster, because Senator Sinema said she's against those changes to prevent establishing a precedent where then Republicans can make sweeping changes if and when they regain control. Does she have a point?
You know, I can't speak to what Republicans will or will not do. Here's what I would say to the senator from Arizona respectfully. All around the country, we've seen Republican-dominated legislatures introduce and pass legislation to limit our participation at the ballot box. And while I mentioned earlier in my commentary the fact that every time we've had reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act, it came under Republican leadership. But what we've seen around the country is that every time there's been a shift in the political power in this country, and where you had a very extreme, handsome turnout among black and brown voters in particular, you see these elevated efforts from Republicans in order to suffocate and silence those voices. We've seen that happen traditionally. And so while the senator from Arizona may be focused on what could come tomorrow, I think as Democrats, we have to focus on what's today, because voting rights in this country is equivalent to survival for many of us. And so what Senate Democrats and what most people around the country are saying, and that's above 50%, are saying, let's take a vote. Let's take stock to see where we are. The efforts to not want to bend the rules, not even change them, but bend the rules with the carve out to vote on the voting rights legislation will not even allow senators to take a vote. And I don't think a constituent in this country wants their U.S. senator or their member of Congress in the House of Representatives not to be able to take a vote to see where they stand.
Antjuan, looking forward, President Biden's approval ratings continue to decline. You are a Democratic strategist. Will this be a problem for Democrats as the midterms approach?
Well, the president is not on the ballot in the 2022 midterms. Democrats in the House and Senate, statewide and local offices are. However, his agenda is on the ballot. And the good news for Democrats, and the reason I'm cautiously optimistic about November of this year, is that the major pieces of legislation that this president has advocated for and put his neck on the line for, they poll above 50% among Democrats and Republicans. You will not find a piece of legislation that this White House has advocated for that the American people do not think very highly of and that will not transform the lives of people. And so I think, if not anything, Democrats as a whole have to wrap their arms around the president's agenda and talk about what this agenda would do for communities, what they would do for individuals, and what they would do for families. Everything this president has advocated for are things he talked about on the campaign trail, but also the reason people love Joe Biden, because they are, forget about political pieces of legislation, they're people-focused legislative ideas, and I think that's critically important.
And we are also now joined by Leslie Sanchez. She is a CBS News political analyst and Republican strategist. Leslie, great to see you. So I'm going to ask you about some of the same things that I've been talking to Antjuan about. You know, the Republicans are saying that they will not get behind any of this voting rights legislation. Why are Republicans essentially against these bills? And do you see any voting rights legislation that they might support?
These are great points. And then I thought Antjuan had some really good points about where the Democrats are and how Republicans are looking at this. Look, fundamentally, where they see this particular piece of legislation is to federalize statewide elections. And that is not anything that they have an appetite for. And it's not just the House, I would say, House and Senate leadership. It's all the way down ballot when you start looking at statewide polls in terms of where the electorate is right now. And the reason is people felt that there were a lot of changes that came very rapidly during the pandemic and the course of the election, and they talk about election security, but they don't want to credential individuals and allow individuals to vote who they feel that they are kind of going around the system and does not have that checks and balances all the way down. Voter identification, for example. A lot of these particular things that have been successful at the state level all of a sudden are getting tremendous resistance and now are taboo when you're talking about it in a political sense. So that idea, and Republicans are quick to point out, look at where the Democrats are. Not only do they want to federalize these elections, but if you look at what they're doing in places like New York City, now they're opening elections to non-citizens. That is what the internal conversations sound like on the Republican side. So they see this as, you know, in the same way that they've combated open borders and a lot of what the Democratic left has pushed for, they would say that this is open elections, and they want to push back on anything that sounds or questions the integrity of elections statewide.
So, you know, what do you think then Republicans could get behind? Because, you know, these bills not only address issues at the ballot box and the issues you mentioned of federal versus, you know, sort of local oversight, but larger issues connected to elections, including eliminating partisan gerrymandering, which, of course, both parties, you know, should be against, and making federal campaign spending more transparent. So, Leslie, how do Republicans feel about those issues? Are there some issues that they could get behind? As well as, you know, there has been apparently some support for, you know, tightening up the electoral system, right? Some of the stuff that we saw play out in January 6th, people don't want to see that repeated. So, Leslie, are there things that Republicans could get behind?
I do think there's a lot of common ground. You're seeing it more, Tanya, right now on the state level, right? You're seeing Republicans and Democrats work together. Let's talk about gerrymandering. That is the mother's milk of politics, the third rail, where the state legislatures, in most cases that are in control of the states, are the ones that draw these lines. And you see so much resistance, especially when it comes to communities of color and how individuals who look like Antjuan and myself have the ability to you know, have their voice heard in very important congressional races. That is a long, ongoing conversation. There's definitely area for improvement. I think Republicans would come to the table on that. They would certainly come to the table on things when you're looking at voter ID, you know, ensuring that the individuals who should be voting in the state are citizens. There's a lot of ways I think that Republicans would come to the table. They've been successful on the state level in terms of moving and advancing those efforts forward. And they're not moving them alone. They're moving them with overwhelming support on the state level from Republicans, Democrats, mostly Republicans and independents. So again, in this very hyper-political environment, changing the system in the Senate, changing the way kind of the way that this moves forward legislatively is not the answer as much as what the president had the opportunity to do and reach across the aisle and work with Republicans. There's a long precedence for that. Everything from his predecessor, with Affordable Care Act to going back further back, welfare reform, telecom reform, budget reconciliation. Republicans and Democrats can work together, but it cannot be in this issue of what we talk about, federalizing or completely blocking out Republicans altogether.
All right, Leslie Sanchez and Antjuan Seawright, thanks to both of you for joining us. We appreciate it.